From the subreddit TooAfraidToAsk. Why is it a problem in America that you have to show your ID to vote? I was just listening to a podcast from like a year ago, and someone mentioned Georgia wanting to pass a law that would make it mandatory for people to show their ID when voting, and everyone was appalled. I know the voting process is kinda stupid over there and you have to register for some reason and whatnot, but in Europe, it is absolutely normal to go to your local voting place where you are automatically registered, and you come there and show your ID that proves that you are the person with the right to vote, and you get a paper and you go into a booth and fill it out and then you drop it into a box. I don't even understand the issue. I had to get my ID recently in Texas. I'd let it expire, so I had to bring my birth certificate, which I only had a copy of. That wasn't good enough. Couldn't get my ID. Contacted the state of Arizona to get my birth certificate. To do that I had to have a valid, non-expired ID, which I didn't have because I need a copy of my birth certificate to get the ID. So I had to call my mom in Colorado to see if she could get a copy of my birth certificate. To do that she needed to provide a copy of her birth certificate, which she didn't have. So she had to contact the state of Kansas, where she was born, get them to send her birth certificate to Colorado so she could send it to Arizona so they could send her my birth certificate that she could send it to me in Texas so I could get my ID, all because I didn't have an official copy of my birth certificate. The whole process took about 3 months and the work of 3 state governments working in 4 states to make happen. Okay. Here are both issues. Issue 1, you have to vote in the correct precinct. If you don't live in Chicago, for example, you should have no say regarding who is on Chicago's school board. The only way to ensure people are voting in the correct precinct is to have them show an ID with their current address. Issue 2, it is illegal to prevent someone from voting who has a legal right to do so. If you make it difficult or impossible for them to obtain an ID, you are violating this law. For example, Texas had their voter ID law deemed unconstitutional because it didn't recognize reservation birth certificates, thus preventing anyone born on a reservation from voting. My grandmother's only easily accessible ID was her driver's license. She was paralyzed on her right side, and so couldn't drive. The driver's license was very expired. The amount of work it took for me, a 15-year-old girl, to get all these county people to just let my poor grandma vote sucked. Put it to you like this, for example, earlier this century, Alabama implemented a requirement for voter ID. The government would not send you an ID, however. You have to go get it. To get your voter ID, you had to go to your local Department of Motor Vehicles, DMV, office. Simple, no problem, right? They then proceeded to close half the DMV offices in the state. Mainly in poorer, predominantly minority counties. People who had no driver's license now had to drive an hour. And what stations were left became horribly overloaded. So, of course, getting your ID to vote became much, much harder. That's why I oppose it. Because the people who want to implement it do not want more secure elections. They want to make it harder to vote. Plain and simple. The answer is simple. Some states in the US require a government-issued photo ID to vote, and some states allow other forms of identity verification, i.e. you show a birth certificate and proof of residency to vote, then they do signature verification when you show up to vote or mail in your ballot. States that require strict photo IDs show no lower levels of identity impersonation fraud than states that do not, and it occurs at insignificant rates anyway. But states that require strict voter IDs do show a slightly lower voter turnout in very specific demographics: poor, elderly, and those with limited mobility, i.e. it's hard for them to get to the DMV to get an ID. So the simple answer is, voter IDs do not solve the problem they are designed to address, and they create new problems that are worse than the problem they are trying to address. Having a photo ID is not mandatory in the US. For most Americans, the photo IDs they have are driver's licenses and maybe passports. So those who are too poor to own cars or travel internationally are the ones less likely to have them. Considering that 8% of white adults and 25% of black adults don't have photo IDs, it's often interpreted as a form of implicit racial discrimination. It shouldn't be. You want the people who are eligible to vote to be able to exercise their rights, but you also want a fair election. The solution is pretty easy. Provide a voting ID for free every 5 years. Make it good for absolutely nothing else, nothing. That way people will put it in the dresser drawer, get it out to vote, then put it back. Cuts down on lost/stolen IDs. Get the offices to stay open early/stay open late for people who work normal business hours. Or open Saturdays. Those who are able to get ID don't have an issue with this, but communities like those in Georgia end up having strict laws like proof of residency being lease agreements or only having one DMV, the place to get your ID, being the only facility for an entire region which could house hundreds of thousands of people, and if you can't call off work you're sort of just stuck not being able to get an ID. Because they only accept forms of ID that you have to pay for. Your social security card, which everyone gets for free at birth, is not valid to show as ID for voting. Your birth certificate is not valid. Your work or college ID is not valid, even if you work for the government. Greater than voter ID laws in the US require a government-issued photo ID. This basically limits you to just a driver's license. To get your license, you need to pay for driving lessons, pay for the driving test, and pay to have your license printed. Greater than so, essentially, the problem is that it's a poll tax. In really cheap states, it might only cost you $40 to $60. In my state it'll run you closer to $160, although we don't require voter ID because we have actual election security laws. Greater than there are more than 3 million voting-age Americans who do not have a government-issued photo ID. Showing ID would enable actual democracy and make it harder to circumvent. There are some people that have a problem with this. I don't get it either. Of course you should have an ID to vote, lol. It's because part of the civil rights movement was to do away with voter restrictions. The US had historically gone to great lengths to disenfranchise people of color. Poll tax was one, and voter ID was another. As an economically depressed class in general, people of color are statistically more likely to be turned away with systems like this in place, as well as to vote liberal. It's just numbers. Sometimes a politician will win by a crazy small number of votes. It's a poll tax. It's simple, it shouldn't be a problem. To make a long story short, it makes it harder for scammers to vote multiple times. The parties that do not like the identification requirement depend on fraudulent votes. Getting an ID is not free in the US. That means you're preventing poor people from voting. We could make IDs free and that could likely resolve the issue. WTF USA. How is voting without ID even possible? Makes absolutely no sense. Simple answer: it's not. The issue is getting an ID for some, due to schedule constraints or cost of the ID. But rather than push for laws to get IDs at a cheaper price / free, people fight against the absolute need to prove who you are to cast a ballot. Not America, just USA. In Chile things work just as in Europe, and I'm sure most of the continent works the same way. Now I can't wrap my head around how the hell does someone go voting without their ID. It's just so stupid. People of color cannot get ID is the most ridiculous argument I have heard. I come from India, the world's largest democracy. The most extreme tribes and poverty-stricken people have voter ID, so I don't know why America is against voter ID. There is literally no reason I can think of. An ID isn't free. Even where states claim the voter ID is free, the paperwork to get the voter ID is not free. Then the red tape and taking time off to get that paperwork could be tough to get for poor working two jobs. In addition, there is no widespread voter fraud. None. So there isn't a problem here that need to be fixed. It's just a way for the right to try to make it harder for the poor to vote. Period. Super Democratic Norway. Sure, you have to show it. Vote I in your own area. I missed out 2 elections because I was in the wrong area at the time. And forgot to pre-voting. I'd cost at least $100 for a passport, 800-ish knock. So yeah. I do not see the issue. It just makes it more safe. In your country you might have a free ID issued by the government. Here we do not. The government IDs that people need require someone to either have a driver's license or to purchase this ID at some local government office. As a result of the way we get the picture ID here, these types of laws amount to voter suppression because only certain classes of people won't have this ID already, which includes poor people and minorities. So these laws are intended to improve the voting outcomes on the Republican side by preventing a portion of the Democratic vote from happening. Don't you have to have an ID card of some kind to obtain food stamps and Medicaid? If voter ID laws guaranteed the following, then there'd be no issue / resistance. Obtaining an ID is free, obtaining documents needed for an ID is free and takes no more than a few, 6 weeks, time to obtain an ID takes no more than 4 hours, places to obtain an ID are within walking distance, for those without a driver's license, or accessible by other free transportation taking no more than 30 minutes to travel. Places to obtain an ID are open beyond 9 to 5 to permit those who work standard jobs to go. None of those conditions exist in America. Voter ID laws are designed to suppress the non-white vote. I was a poll worker in Ohio for a while a few years back. We accepted things like utility bills, something that had your name and address on it. No problem, well, except one asshole, another story for another time. Problem is that some poor people and/or the elderly can't just go get a driver's license. The cost of the license itself, maybe $20, might mean a couple or more meals. Then the cost of going to the DMV, lost work to do the whole process, if you can even get off. And don't forget the cost and time to get the birth certificate to get the DL in the first place. So, yeah.